So here we go. Judea-Africa-America. Our racial relationship history and the crisis in Israel Palestine. So, talking about black folks in Israel is a topic that rarely ever discussed in mainstream media here in the United States, at least. And it seems to me that almost the only time this had come up in recent years, about 5 years ago, this man, the owner then of an American basketball team, he said, "You go to Israel and the blacks are just treated like dogs." Now, it's interesting, but it was stated and then never explored, never interrogated. No one really took it apart and tried to figure out, well, is this true? Is there any basis for this? Are black folks in Israel, in fact, treated like dogs, as he says? Well, talking just about the elite, the black folks that are the most privileged in Israel, talking about basketball players who are brought to the country in order to play on Israeli sports teams. Just about those folks, a few years ago, Israel actually anointed its first sports commissioner, and his name is Oded Tira. On his very first day in office as sports commissioner, there had just been a championship basketball game, and he says, "There are those who didn't like that you played with 5 N-word for much of the championship game." This was his first day in office. Great. That wasn't a singular event. Also, Moti SASSON, the mayor of Holon, suburb of Tel Aviv, he also had some choice words to say about African-American basketball players in Israel. He said, "I don't want to see foreigners. If you want to see the N-word, there's the NBA." So there's a pattern here. Also, we can't just relegate this, say this is only like a secular phenomenon. Sadly, this is also commonplace amongst religious officials in Israel. So, unlike perhaps in some variants of Christianity, like Catholicism, where there's like one single pope, in Israel, we say 2 Jews, 3 opinions. So also in the religion, certainly in Israel, in any case, there's not one chief rabbi, but 2. For Ashkenazi Jews, Jews whose ancestors were from Northern Europe, or Eastern Europe, or Northern Europe, and Sephardi Jews, or Mizrahi Jews, Jews whose ancestors are from Southern Europe, or North Africa, the Middle East. So in any case, the 2 chief rabbis of Israel, first let's start with the Ashkenazi chief rabbi, David Lau. He is not only a chief rabbi, he's the chief rabbi's son of a former chief rabbi. So we see how these dynasties go. Now, again, his first day in office when he's made chief rabbi of Israel, day 1, he says, commenting about religious youth, he's upset that they're interested in basketball. He says, quote, "What do you care if the N-word that get paid by Tel Aviv beat the N-word that get paid by Greece?" Castigating them for taking an interest. This chief rabbi. And like I said, he's not the only chief rabbi. We have another chief rabbi, Sephardi. Also, he too, chief rabbi, the son of a former chief rabbi. This is how we do. And he says a couple years ago in his weekly lecture, if you see a Negro, you bless God for altering creation. Which Negro? It must be a Negro whose father and mother are white. If you know their child turned out like that, a monkey. Oh, so this didn't make it into the US media? That might be a problem. Now, clearly you're scandalized by this. You're not the only ones. Some people actually came to the rabbi afterwards and how dare you say such a thing? But he actually had the audacity to defend himself. He said, well, the words of the rabbi are quoted from the Babylonian Talmud. He says, quote, "If one sees a Negro, an elephant, or an ape, one says, 'Blessed is he who makes strange creatures.'" So we see that there's a problem that isn't only starting from the dawn of Zion or the modern Zionist movement. Okay, there's a problem that goes back even further. We need to look at the religious texts as well as the secular movements. So it goes back at the very least to the Rambam. This rabbi, know him as Maimonides. He's so lionized in Israel actually that his visage was on the 1 shekel bill. We no longer have a 1 shekel bill at this point. They're only coins, because of inflation. But back when we had in Israel a 1 shekel bill, his face was on the bill. So Maimonides, or Moses ben Maimon, there's a famous saying about him. in the Jewish tradition, they say, "Mimoshe ad Moshe lo kam kemoshe," which means from Moses to Moses, there were none greater than Moses. And what people mean by this is that after Moses from the Bible, the lawgiver, Moses, that he was, the first emissary, the first, person to, the initiator of Jewish nationalism, the founding father of the Jewish nation, you say. So since the time of the lawgiver, there were no other greater rabbis than Maimonides. After him, he was the next greatest rabbi. So when Orthodox Jews calculate what is the law, how do we determine what is and isn't Jewish law, what do we practice, they refer back to Maimonides. He's the authoritative religious figure that they go by. So what does he have to say about black folks? Well, he's writing like 1,000 years ago, and approximately, and he says, "Negroes and the nomads in the South, and those who resemble them in our climates, their nature is like the nature of mute animals. They are not on the level of human beings. Their level among existing things is below that of a man and above that of a monkey." Okay, seriously problematic stuff here. Now, the problem is not even more so, it's okay, we've got some really base racism here, anti-blackness, but the truth is that racism wouldn't have had the same effect if it didn't have the ability to latch onto religious texts that preceded him in the Bible itself, texts that permitted slavery, that allowed for it. So you go back to Leviticus chapter 25, and you read the text, and it says straight up, "Of the nations that are all around you, of them you shall buy bondsmen and bondsmaids. And of the children of the residents that live amongst you," the non-Jewish residents of the land, "they may be your possession. And you may make them an inheritance for your children after you. You may enslave them forever, for all time, perpetually. But over your brethren, the children of Israel, you shall not rule one over another ruthlessly." Okay, now I have to say something here. Put the brakes on for a moment, because let's not pretend that this is only the case in Judaism. Far from it. It goes without saying, there's massive Christian, Muslim complicity, in the transatlantic slave trade. Christianity, Islam do not get off the hook in any way, shape, or form. But so we cannot say that Jewish people were overrepresented in the slave trade, that they were the largest financiers of the slave trade or the primary beneficiaries of the slave trade. I have not at least found any evidence to say that. However, we can also not whitewash the record and pretend that there was no involvement or minimal involvement or hardly any. That is absolutely false, as I will go on to explain right now. So keeping that in mind, we go to the Americas, let's say, start where it was worst. The worst place was in South America, in Suriname, in the northern coast of South America, between the Guyanas. And there, because most places in North America, let's say here in the United States, Jews, I think, account for approximately 2% of the American population. And that's pretty much the case throughout. But in these specific settlements, there were some settlements in the Americas where Jews actually were larger proportions of the population, including in one town in Guyana that they actually called Yoden Savan, the Jewish savannah. And in these communities where they established synagogues and established slave plantations and imported slaves from the African continent. And in the event that these slaves escaped and fled into the jungle, for their freedom and created independent communities there, then those Jewish communities actually assembled militias who would go out into the jungles and hunt these escaped slaves down and bring them back to their communities. And of course, when they would find them, make an example of them in horrific ways. So the texts actually support this. It's not that I'm, these are some kinds of conspiracy theories. There's lots of documentation of this, even though it's rarely ever discussed. So at this time, we see that even synagogues in the Yoden Savan actually authored prayers to bless these Jewish soldiers who were going out into the wild and hunting down and capturing these escaped slaves. This is a translation of one of these Hebrew prayers that the synagogue said. Save and deliver those who are setting out to fight our enemies, the Negroes, cruel and rebellious. Conquer and destroy all cruel and rebellious Africans, our enemies who are planning evil against us. Okay, this is as they went out into the jungles to hunt down these Africans. Like I said, this isn't a figment of my imagination, if only. We can go to Cecil ROTH, who was a British historian, Oxford educated, member of the Royal Historical Society. Also, there's a street named after him in Israel. He also authored the Encyclopedia Judaica in the first edition, and many other books, including this one, History of the Marranos, of Jewish folk from the Iberian Peninsula, Spain, Portugal. And what he wrote about the Joden Savan, he wrote, "The Jews of the Joden Savan were also foremost in the suppression of the successive Negro revolts from 1690 to 1722. These, as a matter of fact, were largely directed against them as being the greatest slaveholders of the region." So again, in this specific instance, they happened to be the most numerous of the population, so therefore they were also the most numerous of the slaveholders in Suriname, and that's why these slaves... So anyways, this is all documented. Of course, that was the worst that it got. In most parts of the Americas, Jews were a minority, and they, only were a minority of the slaveholders, but they participated to the level that they could. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So moving on, sorry, I should also point out he's not the only person to document this. We also have Simon Wolfe. Simon Wolfe was an American official who was made U.S. consul to Egypt in the 1880s. In the early 1900s, he actually was the president of B'nai B'rith, a Jewish one of the first Jewish American organizations that became the forerunner of the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League. So Simon Wolfe, American diplomat, leader of a Jewish community, so consul to Egypt, he wrote he authored this book, The American Jew as Patriot, Soldier, and Citizen. And in this book, he talks about the Joden Savan and the groups of Jews that they sent out to recapture African slaves. He says, "The company returned, bringing with them the trophies, namely 6 hands severed from fallen Negroes." Yeah, problematic to say the least. Now, moving to the north, okay, we go to another American Jewish historian, Bertram KORN. Bertram KORN was actually not only the senior rabbi right here in Philadelphia at Congregation Knesset Israel, but in addition to that, he was buried at Arlington Cemetery because he was, as far as I understand, the first U.S. chaplain, or the first Jewish chaplain to receive flag rank in any American armed forces. So, very respected figure, and he authored this book called Jews and Negro Slavery in the Old South, 1789 to 1865. In that book, he wrote, talking now about not moving from South America, moving to the American South. So right here in the United States, he wrote that any Jew who could afford to own slaves and had need for their services would do so. Goes on to say, there's no iota of evidence that these Jews gave support to the slave system out of fear of anti-Jewish prejudice. So we can't say that Jewish folks in the South were only held slaves because they were worried that if they did do so, then they would incite the ire of the Christian population around them against their communities. That wasn't the case, unfortunately. But I don't want to paint it with too broad of a brush. Certainly there were dissenting voices. There were those who did not participate. It's important to note them as well, most definitely. One example, just August BONDI, out of Nemmer. This man, he was a Jew from Austria, grew up in Vienna, and he actually participated in the pro-democracy protests that rocked Austria in the mid-1800s. When those failed, he gave up, decided to move to America. He immigrated to this country. He moved out to Kansas, where he started homesteading there. And because he was repelled by slavery, and because he insisted on working his own land, with his own with the sweat of his own brow, he became targeted by slave forces or slave owners, slaveholders in Kansas. And so when he and his property were attacked by pro-slavery militias, he actually linked up with John Brown and fought with him in the Battle of Blackjack, which some folks consider like the opening shot of the American Civil War. He went on to become a judge and a postmaster in Kansas, and his autobiography, it's recorded in congressional records, and as well we have a Yiddish translation of it that survives. So certainly there were those who speak out and not only spoke out, but put their lives on the line, had skin in the game. It's important to note that. But if we look at the general trend, we see that this was documented by anti-slavery societies, abolitionist societies in the United States. And in this particular American and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society, when they published a report on the eve of the Civil War, what they wrote was, the Jews of the US have never taken any steps whatever with regard to the slavery question. Of course, they're now talking about the general Jew, the organized, the established Jewish community of that time, not individuals. Certainly there were exceptions, but as a general rule, the community, the organized community, did not take any step here or there. They stood on the sidelines. They wrote, the objects of oppression, as the Jews have been for ages, surely they, more than any other denomination, ought to oppose slavery. We would have wanted them. We would have hoped. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case, and we have to admit to that. I gain no pleasure from describing these facts, but it's important that we look the facts dead in the eye and have an honest accounting of what actually happened. We can't move forward until we face those facts. Only then can we maybe have a truth and reconciliation process. But it's important that we look at it dead in the eye. And in fact, what happened was, thanks. So we look at the Jewish synagogues in the United States, in the American South, and we see, for example, at Bet Shalom Synagogue. It was the first synagogue in Richmond, Virginia. And we see that encoded in its constitution, they say that you could only be a member of the synagogue if you were free men. Okay, so that's obviously a euphemism for saying only white folks, white Jews, could become members of the synagogue. But of course, in other synagogues, like Bet Elohim in Charleston, South Carolina, which I might add was at the time considered the most liberal of all the synagogues in the United States, their constitution, authored in 1920, actually they didn't launder their language at all. They just said straight up that you could only become a member as long as he, she, or they are not people of color. So there's a level of complicity there that we need to confront. And of course, we can look to the writings of the rabbis at that time, and we see lots of evidence for more of the same. So this is Maximilian Michelbacher, and he was the rabbi of Bet Ahava Synagogue, also in Richmond, Virginia. And this is a synagogue that was firmly rooted in this community. It housed not only the first Jewish school in Richmond, but also the first public school of any kind, serving any community for Jews, Christians, and others in Richmond, Virginia, rather. And so he says, he delivered a speech in which he weighed in on the topic of slavery. And what he had to say was, the manservants and the maidservants thou hast given unto us that we may bear rule over them. They incite, now he's talking about the abolitionist forces in the United States. They incite our manservants and maidservants to insurrection, to assassinate and to slay the men, women, and children, cause them to fall into destruction, which in their evil intents they digged for us, our wives and our children. Like he has the audacity to flip the script and say, oh, it's you abolitionists who are the evil ones, and it's, oh, us poor slaveholders who are the victims here. It's a lot of chutzpah to make this claim, but this was the discourse. And of course, he was far from the only rabbi to say such things. This is Bernard Levy. Can't remember the names of every single synagogue, off by heart. Got to write some of them down. In any case, so Bernard, at this time, we're talking about on the eve of the Civil War, there were approximately 200 Jewish communities in the United States, and of those communities, there were only maybe 4 rabbis on their payroll. 4 Orthodox rabbis, rather. Of the 200 communities, maybe 4 Orthodox rabbis, and Bernard Levy was the most senior of them, accorded the most respect. He was the rabbi of the Baltimore Hebrew congregation, the Lloyd Street Shul. And in 1861, he gives a sermon in synagogue, the National Fast Day, it was called. And he delivers his speech. This is what he had to say. Why did not Moses prohibit the buying or selling of slaves? Was there ever a greater philanthropist than Abraham? And why did he not set free the slaves? Who can blame our brethren of the South? The government will not protect the property rights. Now, if you can imagine, this speech was so popular among slaveholders that once he made it and it was publicized, he actually was offered other positions. The synagogue in New Orleans actually offered him their senior rabbi position. So on the basis of this, he actually improved his economic position. It was worthwhile for him to make such statements. So he moved to Sha'arei Chesed synagogue in New Orleans. So until now, I've been focusing on the South, but it would be erroneous of us to say, oh, that's only a Southern phenomenon. That is not the case at all. Moving up to the north, we have Morris Jacob Raphael. He was the senior rabbi at Bnei Yeshurun synagogue in New York City. And at this time, he is not only the highest paid rabbi in the United States, but also the highest paid clergyman of any denomination, of any religion at this time. He actually was the first rabbi to give an address at the opening session of Congress. So very highly respected rabbi. And in 1861, again, on the eve of the Civil War, he gives a sermon that is so popular, this sermon called The Bible View of Slavery, that actually collected funds afterwards to, he repeated the sermon again and again, and they actually saved up funds so that they could publish it as a pamphlet. And what he had to say in his Bible View of Slavery, so-called, he says, "Throughout the world, the unfortunate Negro is indeed the meanest of slaves. Much has been said respecting the inferiority of his intellectual powers. No man of his race has ever inscribed his name on the pantheon of human excellence, either mental or moral. In the face of protection afforded in the Ten Commandments, how dare you denounce slaveholding as a sin? You, if you do so, you are guilty of something very little short of blasphemy." The chutzpah, it's disgusting. He's trying to gaslight people who oppose slavery, saying, you should be ashamed of yourselves. This was the discourse. Now, again, I don't mean to suggest by any stretch of the imagination that this was, the only view. There were people who dissented from this line. Certainly, one of the voices who spoke with moral clarity was this man, David EINHORN. David EINHORN was probably the most prominent Reform rabbi at that time. He was the leader of the Reform movement in Judaism. He was the first rabbi of a Reform congregation that was Reform right from the start, and Har Sinai Synagogue in Baltimore. And he also, among other things, he published the first prayer book that became the basis, Olat Tamid, the basis of the Reform movement's first prayer book, Jewish prayer service. So, a significant voice. And also, with his printing press, he actually also published, anti-slavery polemics. And in 1961, he actually gave a speech about this, as a contra in order to refute or rebut the speech of Rabbi Raphael in Bnei Yeshurun in New York. He said, the Jewish religious press must raise objections to this if it does not want Judaism branded forever. So he took a serious stand, but for doing so, he paid the price, even just for those words. So as I said, on the eve of the Civil War, April 19th, riots break out in Baltimore. Anti-abolition riots or pro-slavery riots, and mobs ravaging through the city, attacking anyone who is suspected of being an abolitionist. And among those folks who were attacked were also David EINHORN. His printing press was demolished. His house was broken into. All the furniture was taken outside and burned in a big pile. He himself barely escaped with his life. Him and his family were spirited away by his supporters, and they fled right here to Philadelphia. And later on, he became also a rabbi of Knesset Israel synagogue right here in Philadelphia, where he spent his days. So this was the general trend. The people who supported slavery were given rank, were treated with respect. The people who spoke out against it became the victims of attack. And we see in the years following slavery, there's people who went on to glory, who became established leaders of the community, who found, like Isaac Mayer Weiss in Cincinnati, Ohio. He not only was the rabbi at Bnei Shurun synagogue there, but also he essentially founded what's called the Central Conference of American Rabbis, the central movement of the reform, the reform stream of Judaism. But this man who was the pillar of his community, to maybe in the years after the Civil War, he's held up as some kind of moral exemplar, but the truth is, that's a whitewash. In the years leading up to the Civil War, he said straight up, we are not prepared, nobody is, to maintain it's absolutely unjust to purchase savages. So the overall record is one in which, sadly, we failed as a community. We did not stand up for moral righteousness when we needed to be counted and stand for justice. Now, up until this point, you may have noticed that in addition to the quotes and the faces and the names, I've also used a kind of iconography, a visual language. Beside the name of each person that I quote, I've made a little symbol there, a colored dot. Okay, here there's a letter S. Here's what I'm talking about, so you can see from the back. So this wasn't accidental. I'm actually, what's the purpose of this? Well, I'll explain. I'm actually giving out grades here. So this is what I mean by that. In a couple of weeks, Jewish folks here and around the world are going to be celebrating Passover, Pesach, and on Passover we have this tradition where we divide the Jewish world into four. We say there's four types of Jews. This is what we say. And then we list them and we describe them. And here are some of the illustrations in the Haggadot of yesteryear, of the readings that we tell each other on the Passover holiday. And so I'm going to adopt this. I'm going to reclaim or claim this tradition and say also that it makes sense to divide the Jewish community into four political camps. I think that it would help us gain, be able to parse this information and understand what we're up against, what the Jewish public opinion, how it can be understood. So four political camps, I would wager, and these are those four: reformist, opportunist, supremacist, and humanist. And if we take the first letter of each of those camps, it turns out the acronym Rosh, which means head. It's a Hebrew word. It helps me, if no one else. Now, what does this mean? What are these four camps? What they mean, or how they're to be understood, is we ask the question, what is their relationship to the Torah, to the Jewish religious texts, to the Bible? So we ask two questions. We say, is the Torah holy? Yes or no? And we ask, is the Torah just? Yes or no? So, moving into the 19th century, basically the form of Judaism as we know it is Orthodox Judaism, supremacist, and they would answer yes to both of these questions. They would say that yes, the Torah is holy, it's divine, it's from God, and yes, it's just, it's fair. When it says that we are the chosen people and we have ownership over the land of Israel, that is fair and legitimate. So they would say yes to both questions. Now, in the second half of the 19th century, we see the emergence of three other camps, or three other trends. We see the Reform Judaism, we call them the Reformist. Now their answers are different. They say, yes, we believe that the Jewish tradition is inspired by God, that it is holy, in fact. But they would argue it's not just. It's not okay as it is. It's problematic. We need to amend it. We need to amend the Constitution. We need to amend the religious constitution, the Torah texts. And that's why they tinker with it and adapt it. So that's the Reform movement, the Reformist. The next camp, I'd say also emerging at that time, the late 1800s, the modern Zionist movement, I'd call them the opportunist camp. And they have the exact opposite response to those questions. They say, is the Torah holy? Of course not. It's just invented by people. It's literature and nothing else. But is it just? Yes, it's just when it claims that we are the chosen people. So to summarize, no, I don't believe in God, but yes, God gave me this land and made me the owner of it. So, and then we have the fourth of the camps also. We have the modern socialist movement, late 1800s, and I call them the humanist camp. And they answer to those questions no and no. So no, we do not believe that these texts are divine from any superior being, and no, it's not just. We can't accept these dictates to be our moral instructions. So now, I can imagine that maybe there's some people in the room who might say at this point, how do you expect me to believe this, David? You want me to accept, to say that these are the four camps, but it sounds like you're biased. It sounds like, you're essentially injecting your own personal opinion here when you're describing them as supremacist and humanist. You're clearly showing what you're thinking and feeling. And okay, legitimate. I'm not trying to pretend I'm something I'm not. I'm trying to be honest and open about my own opinions. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that the facts I'm describing aren't accurate. And one ways we can see this is, I would argue that the other Jews from the other political camps, or folks from the other political camps, would also recognize the same four-camp breakdown. They would just call them something different. They would describe them differently. So let's say you're a reformist. So you would say, oh no, we are the stable ones. We provide stability to the system. The Zionists, they're too hawkish. Those religious camps, they're old school. And those socialists, they're just too far left. We are the stable ones. But they would still describe them using those categories in a way. Or let's say the Zionists, they would say, oh, we're the heroic camp of the Jewish community. Those reformists, they're spineless, and the Orthodox, they're useful to us. They support nationalism, and those socialists, they're traitorous to the Jewish people. And so every camp would say this. The religious camp, the Orthodox camp would say we're the intelligent ones, right? So every camp would see itself in the most noble terms, but they would still see those four camps. So I would argue that this is the framework that we should adopt if we want to better understand what's happening, the discourse that goes on in the Jewish community. Now, you don't need to we can try to use language that isn't loaded. We can say those same camps, with language that's a bit neutral. We can say, okay, they're liberals, nationalists, religious, and socialists. That might be a better breakdown for some folks. Fair enough, but it doesn't make a snappy acronym. And so a little bit unwieldy, and of course I'm the one making the presentation, so I'm going to use the ROSH, R-O-S-H system. So this is just the language we're going to use to describe the rest of the story. So now, up until now, I thought it was important to talk a little bit about the stuff that we're bringing into the conversation. Now that we had a few words about the history of Jewish-Black relations in the Americas, at least up to the Civil War. Now we're going to move to Israel. I do have a lot to say also about the history about Black-Jewish alliance here in the Civil Rights era. I have a lot to say about that, but we're going to save that for the fall. I'm going to come back to North America at that time, hopefully to Philadelphia as well, and then I will discuss that in much greater detail. But for the purposes of this talk, if I went into that, I'd never be able to get to the story in Israel, and I think it's important because that's where I'm coming from, and that's something you don't see every day, and that's something that the mainstream media, deletes and censors. So I'm going to now go to the other side of the pond and discuss the experience of Black folks in Israel Palestine, the various African communities in that country. So Black folks here in the United States. Clearly, there's also diverse religious communities here. And we see, especially in the 20th century, the emergence of large Black Muslim communities. But it's not only to Islam that Black folks migrate, but also to Judaism. This is a photograph from Harlem 100 years ago. So there is a long history of Black Jewish communities, and it's important to talk about them. I'm not going to go too deep because we're trying to move back to Israel to describe that legacy. But as there's a long history of back to the land, back to Africa movements, here there's also not only a non-denominational Pan-Africanist movement, there are also Jewish back to Africa movements. And we talk about the Hebrew Israelites or the Black Hebrews, and there's lots of different communities, various different communities, and they all have their own flavor. But one of these communities decided that they would not only practice their own variant of the Jewish religion, but that they would also become Zionists, essentially African-American Zionists, that they would not only become Jews of a sort, but they would also move to Israel. And so we have in late 60s, early 70s, and then in the 80s, continuing this group called the African Hebrew Israelites. They were based mainly in Chicago, some folks in Detroit, DC, and other US cities, and they decide to move to Israel outright and to form an intentional community there. This is actually where I live. I live in the city of Dimona in southern Israel, in the deep south of the Nakab Desert, or the Negev Desert. And they arrived there in 1969. Now, at that point, Dimona is a speck in the middle of a dust bowl. At the time that Israel was established, it didn't even exist. The day before Israel is established, May 13th, 1948, the Prime Minister of Israel, first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, he actually says, I want Dimona to be the capital of Israel. No one agreed with him. Jerusalem became the capital. But this was his idea. He wanted the center of the country to be in the Negev. In any case, when he said this, there was nothing there. It was just desert. But he wanted to control as much land in Palestine as possible. And so he wanted Jews to inhabit that land. Now, at this point, there are Jewish folks moving to the country from all over the world. If you were Ashkenazi, if you were a Jewish person of Northern European or Eastern European extraction, you could decide wherever you wanted to live. You want to live in Tel Aviv, you want to live in Jerusalem, whatever you wanted, you got your wish. But, if you were one of these people whose ancestors were from Morocco or Algeria or Tunisia or North Africa, and you decided to move to Israel at this time, what you found was that you were sent to these desolate areas of the country where nothing existed yet. The government needed you to be a foot soldier, so they would send you there. And they sent you there against your will. So the city of Dimona, here are the first arrivals in the town of Dimona. It wasn't even a town yet, it was just a tent city. Nothing but tents, shambles. You see the Arabic writing on their luggage, because as I said, they came from the North African nations. And it was just desert as far as the eye could see. And they came there against their will, because the government had told them, you're going to Tel Aviv, if you can imagine this. They get on a boat in Fez or Casablanca or whatnot. They sail to Haifa, the port of Haifa in northern Israel, Palestine. They get there, they're put on trucks, they're thinking that they're going to Tel Aviv. They're told they're going to Tel Aviv. They ride hours and hours and hours with their kids and their luggage, and they finally, after hours and hours, they're like, I didn't realize Tel Aviv was so far away. Finally, at the end of the day, it's close to dusk, the trucks drop them off, and they're in the middle of literally nowhere. And they realize that they've been lied to and deceived by the government that they trusted. In fact, of the first 5,000 inhabitants of Dimona, 2/3 of them were sent there against their will, which is a remarkable figure that, again, I imagine that very few of you have heard that statistic before. But this is well documented. So these are the tent cities that they land in when they come there in the early 50s. Eventually, of course, Dimona is built up into a town. Today, there's about 35,000 folks living there, population of Dimona. Now, as I said, it was Jews from the Middle Eastern countries and from North Africa and what we call the Mizrahi communities. And so when we look at photos from that era, we see a lot of folks who dressed like other Arabs, right? Because that's who they were. They were Arab Jews. So a lot of traditional communities, the traditional communities were the ones that first populated that areas we would say the Jews of color, we could call them. And so these are Jews from North Africa. A few years later, we have Jews from India moving to Israel, and they too are sent to these towns in the middle of nowhere, arriving in Dimona. And so when the first African Hebrew Israelites arrive in Israel in 1969, I guess the immigration officials at the border are just like, okay, you're a brown, black Jew. Okay, well, what do we do with brown, black Jews? Oh yeah, we send them down to Dimona. So they send them, they're arriving years later, they sent down to Dimona. That's how it is, that's how it came to be that the Israelites live in Dimona. Now, when they first arrived there, because they stated that they were in fact, we are Jews, and we come back to live in the land, so okay, sure, I guess that's also possible. Black Jews, sure, why not? So they were accorded all the rights and privileges as any other Jewish immigrant to Israel. They were given free housing, free furniture, all kinds of other economic incentives to make the difficult challenge of immigration a little bit easier for them and their families. So we see that they start establishing the beginnings of their nation, of their culture, of their community. But it didn't last long, because after about a year or so, local folks started realizing, wait a second, the Judaism that you claim to be practicing isn't like our Judaism. This is a different Judaism. Y'all are practicing some kind of Afrocentric form of Judaism. That's not the real Judaism. That's not authentic. And so the government gave the community an ultimatum. They said, you got two choices. Either you now convert en masse to our form of Judaism, the authentic form of Judaism in our eyes, or else you can leave. You have no right to be here if you're not Jews. Well, the community leaders were offended by this demand, and they rejected it outright. And the government's response was, okay, you're not Jews in that case. And that means that in that first year, a few people, some of the early immigrants were, they were mothers and fathers and grandfathers as well, and grandmothers too. And so there were a couple folks who actually died in the first year, natural deaths. And when this happened, once the government decided that you're not real Jews and we want you gone, they actually, if you can believe this, they exhumed their bodies from the Jewish cemetery and then just went to the edge of town and left them there in what became the African Hebrew Israelite graveyard of Dimona. And it was very quickly turned into the dump of Dimona. Folks in town would go there if they had any construction, garbage and they needed to get rid of, that's where they would dump it. It's a really sickening story that barely anyone is even aware of, but this is at the edge of town. This is where I live. This is one of the last photographs of it, actually, because just in the last few months, they've bulldozed over it and they've built a new neighborhood for Israeli soldiers who need to be housed in town because they're stationed at an army base nearby. So they're building new neighborhoods for soldiers on what was the African Hebrew graves. They do now, and just in the last few years, they now, because the government realized, okay, maybe we went a bit too far. But at that time, in the 70s, in the 80s, they were treated like garbage. And we can see, how do we know this besides the historical record? Because I went into the Israeli government archives to see what they were writing about and what people were writing about them. And so these are some of the letters that I found in the Israeli government archives. So when Israel decides that we don't want these black folks, these African Americans who've come here, and we're going to kick them out, and they start kicking them out, they start rounding them up and sending them back, taking them to the airport and putting them on a plane back to the US. So when this happens, it comes out in the news, Americans start reading about it, seeing it on the evening news, then we start to get responses. And it wasn't, it wasn't across the board, but certainly in the writings we see people writing to Golda Meir, the Prime Minister of Israel at the time. Or actually, sorry, to the President of Israel at the time. And they write, in tonight's TV, we saw that Israel was expelling black people, women and children. Israel did the right thing. There is never an hour, night or day, that black people don't commit purse snatching, rape, and robbery. They bring drugs to white women. Israel should make a law. When a black man commits any crime, he or she could be expelled to another country. Now, far be it from me to say that this is what every Jewish person thought or felt about the treatment meted out to these African Hebrew Israelites. But this person his wife was the president of B'nai B'rith of San Francisco. Okay? So this is the establishment Jewish voice. Now that's here in America. In Israel, we have Dov Shilansky, who went on to become the Speaker of the Knesset. Okay? He says in the Knesset debate of what to do about these African Hebrews, he says, we need to be putting the Hebrew Negroes on a boat. And then, as the conversation in the Knesset developed, people called, and to drown it at sea. This was how they were treated. Now, in the mid-'80s, at this point, it was the peak of the Israeli government crackdown on the community. And they would just arrest people en masse and deport them willy-nilly. And so the community said, enough is enough. We can't accept this anymore. We need to stand up for ourselves. So the community got together and they said, we are going to do a peaceful protest. We're going to march on Jerusalem, which probably would have taken about 3 days. But that was their intention. They got men, women, and children all dressed in white, to make it a powerful visual symbol. And they set out, they had provisions, and they are about to set out on this mass, walkathon to Jerusalem to protest, to state their piece in front of the Knesset. And once they do so, the Israeli army just circles them. They send in hundreds of troops, tanks, helicopters, and guns aimed at little babies, saying, you're not going nowhere. You aren't walking a foot outside of your community. You're staying right here. Of course, they pushed them back. They didn't allow them to proceed, so that protest didn't occur, but at least there's a visual record of the attempt to do so. And because there was a visual record and people started to hear about it, well, that had an effect. It had some effect. I guess the Israeli government realized this is a Hasbara apocalypse. We can't defend this. When people in the United States see these images, this is already the mid-'80s. So this is no longer acceptable, at least, in a liberal discourse. So the government realized, what? There's only like 3,000 of these people. Yeah, we don't want them here, but maybe we need to bite the bullet. And so the government decided, all right, we'll cut our losses. We will allow them to remain in the country. However, they can only do so if they send all their children, boys and girls, to serve in the Israeli army. Only if you adopt Zionism, essentially. And up until that point, we can say perhaps they were Zionists in the sense that they moved to Israel and made it the center of their lives, but they were also anti-militarist. They didn't want to participate in the organs of the state in that way. But I guess the leader of the community decided that that's what was required if they wanted to not be deported back to the US, which they were dead set against. So they caved and they accepted the deal. And so now the community does send its sons and daughters to the Israeli army. Sadly, they're not citizens yet. Even though they decided to sell out in that way, it didn't pay off because till this day, maybe only 5% of the community has citizenship. They say, if your kids serve in the Israeli army, after they serve in the Israeli army, then they can apply for citizenship. And then after, if they get citizenship, then you, the parents, who've been living here for 40, 45 years at this point, then you can apply for Israeli citizenship. But because of this bureaucratic rigmarole, as I said, a handful of people have achieved this citizenship so far, not more. So I guess in some sense, it was a measure of success. They managed to have a foothold in the country, but what was lost? You won't see photos like this anymore. This is captured at that time, back in the 70s, 80s. You see a group of Hebrew Israelite singers, and they're all wearing different clothing styles, but the one second from the right, where he's wearing a turban, that was once a very popular mode of dress in the community. You'll never see that now because that's associated somehow with Orientalism or Arabs or Muslims. And so that's been excised from the wardrobe of the community. You won't see that anymore. So that was the deal that they had to cut in order to establish a right to continue living in the land. So that's the story of the African Hebrew Israelites. That's one of the African communities in the country. And now I'm going to move to another African community in the country, Ethiopian Jews, the Jews from Ethiopia. Today, they are actually spoken of as proof positive that Israel can't be. How can Israel be racist? What are you talking about? You accuse Israel of racism towards Palestinians? That's audacious of you to say such a thing when in fact there are black Jews. How can we be racist? Well, I find that to be, incredibly offensive. Very, very offensive. And the reason why I find it so offensive is because it inverts reality altogether. To say that Israel had only great intentions and it saved Ethiopian Jews from police. In fact, Israel did everything it could to prevent the immigration of Ethiopian Jews. So what do I mean by that? Well, we look at the historical record. Golda Meir, the Prime Minister of Israel, said famously, what do we need that headache for? We've got enough problems with the Arabs. We don't need to bring black Jews here. It'll just cause more problems. And we see this in the writings of the Israeli emissaries, because it's not that Israel couldn't have brought black Jews to Israel before they came. At that time, Israel had full relations with the Ethiopian government. This is Haile Selassie, the Emperor of Ethiopia, and he's accepting the certifications, the qualifications of Hanani No, who was Israel's ambassador to Ethiopia at that time. So they had full relations and quite close military ties, I might add, as well. But Hanani No, when we go through his writings, we see the missives that he sent back to the government, he actually said, we can't allow these Ethiopian Jews to even visit Israel. Not even to visit. Why? He says, if we do, it will raise the hopes of immigrating for thousands of primitive, illiterate, sick, oppressed people who will never have capacity for. It's Israel's ambassador to Ethiopia. So how did this work? So let's say you were, because as I said, Israel and Ethiopia had close ties at this time, and still do. Now, if an Ethiopian Christian wanted to visit Israel, Ethiopians in general are very religious. If you've ever traveled through Ethiopia, and actually the idea of Israel is really deeply embedded in their culture, even amongst Christians. It's not only amongst Ethiopian Jews. So it's no surprise that Ethiopian folks often want to visit Israel, to see Jerusalem, to see where the church is, and to go to the Jordan River and be baptized there. And so if an Ethiopian Christian family wanted to visit Israel, no problem. They would just go to the Israeli embassy in Addis Ababa, in the capital, and apply for a visa, and received it, no problems, no questions asked. However, if you were a Jewish citizen of Ethiopia, and you wanted just to visit Israel, and you asked for a visa, they would charge you $600 for it, okay? Which at the time was beyond the means of the vast majority of Ethiopians, Jewish, Christian, or otherwise. So in this way, they didn't allow Jews to even visit because they were afraid that they would overstay their visas, that they would want to stay and that they would stay, and they didn't want them to stay because they didn't want black Jews in Israel. Now, some people would say, well, what do you expect, David? You know what Israel did, how it brought those Ethiopian Jews to Israel. It sent planes into the African continent to retrieve them. They took these Hercules jets and they flew them all the way to Ethiopia, and they got these Ethiopian Jews on board and they brought them to Israel, and they've been living in Israel ever since. Now, there's truth to that. Of course, that's part of the historical record. In 1984, but why did it only happen in 1984? You think that only in 1984 did Israel have the ability to send jets around the world? In fact, over a decade earlier, Israel seemingly did the same thing. Took Hercules jet, sent it down to Ethiopia, loaded Ethiopians on board and brought them to Israel, but they didn't bring Ethiopian Jews. Didn't bring Ethiopian Christians either. They brought Ethiopian donkeys. In the early 70s, Israel actually spent $500,000 American dollars, of those dollars of that time. It spent this money in order to bring Ethiopian donkeys to Israel. Now, why would it do such a thing? It did so because at that time, this man who was essentially like a conservationist, like Thoreau of his time, or someone who was one of the leaders of Israel's ecological movement back in the day, and his vision was, this is what he said, we need to bring animals back to Israel. We need to look in the Bible, look in the Torah, look in the Talmud, and see which animals were mentioned there that used to live in the land of Israel. Then if they no longer live in the land of Israel, if they no longer live here, if they've already gone extinct, we need to find where else in the world they still exist, and then bring some of those animals back to the country. Because then we'll be able to say, look, the land is filled with the animals of the Bible. So, just as the land, the flora and the fauna from the time of the Bible have been, are now once again flourishing, so too should the land be ruled by the people who ruled it in the time of the Bible. So, this was part of essentially a propaganda effort to convince people that the Zionist movement is legitimate. So, what does this mean? It means that over a decade before the Israeli government was willing to allow black Jews to step foot on the soil of Israel, they spent $500,000 to bring black donkeys to Israel, or the official term of the military operation, Operation African Wild Ass. Now, this is in the early 70s. By the mid-70s, in the United Nations, there's already increasing opposition to Zionism as a movement. People are thoroughly disgusted with Israel's actions, with its treatment of Palestinian people. They see 1967, the country expands, colonizes the West Bank, Gaza, Golan Heights, East Jerusalem, the Sinai Peninsula. And at this point, it's quite clear that Israel's territorial ambitions are far greater than the original state that it was accorded by the United Nations. So the United Nations passes a resolution essentially saying that Zionism is a form of racism, that Israel ideology is racist towards non-Jews. So when this happens, this is Israel's ambassador to the UN at the time, Chaim Herzog. He criticizes this, and it's a source of shame for Jewish people around the world that the state associated with them is considered to be a racist state. And so some of these American Jews are motivated to try to overturn this idea, to change the perception of the Israeli state. And they go to Ethiopia with the intention of supporting Ethiopian immigration to Israel. Now, I don't mean to say that these activists, that none of them were motivated by anti-racist ideas. I'm certain that no small amount of these American Jews who made it, who fought for the rights of black Jews to immigrate to Israel, I'm sure many of them were motivated by anti-racist ideology, but it can't be, ignored that no small number of them were motivated by with the idea that they tried to change the perception of Israel, that they wanted Israel to be seen as a normal state, and they thought that if they encouraged black Jews to move to Israel, that they could then use them as a fig leaf and say, "What? Me racist?" And that's what they did. So these groups lobbied for the Israeli government to finally allow black Jews to move to Israel. And at this point, the government's like, oh, should we allow them in or shouldn't we allow them in? What should we do? How many of them? Are they Jewish? Are they really Jewish? Are they half Jewish? Are they 3/4 Jewish? I mean, really disgusting stuff. But the Ethiopian Jews themselves said, enough. We're not waiting anymore. We have every right to move to Israel. It's our birthright. As I said, Ethiopian culture, the idea of Israel is firmly embedded in Ethiopian culture, Jewish and Christian. So the Zionist idea was always part of the community's ethos. And once they decided that in the mid-80s, or the early 80s, that they weren't going to wait any longer, whether the government wanted them in or not, they were going to move to Israel. And they started walking on foot. They started walking north and eventually reached Sudan. And there, at this point, they're in refugee camps. And thousands of Ethiopian Jews died there in refugee camps in Sudan and on the way there by the time that the Israeli government decided to let them in. I know of no other incident where this happened. When you look at the photographs of Ethiopian Jews being brought to Israel, these are the photographs that the Israeli government touts as like proof positive of its anti-racist cred, right? But the question you have to ask is, why are they in color? If you look, right? Because all the other Jewish communities around the world, whether they're from Europe or whether they're from Asia or whether, or from North Africa, the Arab countries, they all immigrated to Israel in the early 50s or late 40s, right? It's only the Ethiopian Jews, the black Jews, who were not allowed to move to the country until there was color photography. Not in 48 when the state was established, but only in 1984 that these operations occurred to bring them to the country. Of course, there were Soviet Jews, but it was the Soviet government that didn't allow them to leave the country, as they didn't allow anyone to leave the country, Jewish, Christian, or otherwise. So in any case, this history is not secret, okay? Ethiopian Jews know about this, and they're mad about this. And they're sick and tired of it, frankly, because it never ended. True, they're now being held up as like a, as a fig leaf, as I said, to try to prove to the world that no, we aren't racist. But they're sick and tired of it because the racism never ended. Sure, they were allowed into the country, but they've always been second, third, or fourth class citizens. There's all kinds of ways we can measure that, but of course, the way perhaps we can see it visually expressed is in the streets. This is just from last month. Okay, we have Ethiopian Jews not only taking over the streets, but taking over the highways. This is actually the largest thoroughfare in Israel. This is the Ayalon Highway in downtown Tel Aviv. And people were sick and tired. Now, of course, there's all kinds of ways that racism is experienced in Israeli society. And they have all kinds of complaints. But the way that they, the crime that they feel is most grievous is the police brutality that they experience. And so, of course, I don't need to explain to African American folks in the United States what that looks like. But neither do we need to explain it to Ethiopian Jews, who just last month took over the highway in both directions. There's a monumental achievement. And they're taking over the streets, and you can just read their signs for yourselves, okay? It's in Hebrew, but I've translated it for your benefit. Shotrim rotzchim et beta Israel. Police are murdering Ethiopians. All right? Now, here's a classic example. This is one of the signs of the protesters in Hebrew. 14 mikrei retzach means 14 murders over 5 years, 0 indictments. What's he talking about? He's saying the last 5 years, Israeli police officers have shot and killed 14 Israeli citizens. And in every single one of those instances, the people that they killed were they were all people of color. They were either Palestinian citizens of Israel, or they were Arab Jews, or they were African Jews. 0 indictments. No police officer had to pay the price for those crimes. Yeah, it's obviously a story that I don't need to go into detail about here. You're all too familiar with what that means. But, this is felt very deeply by the community, because if you talk to Ethiopian Jews in Israel, just pick any random person. I mean, if you're close enough to someone, you just say straight up, they'll tell you about their own family history. They'll tell you that it's very difficult to find a family where either they themselves or their brother or their uncle or their sister or their cousin did not suffer some form of police brutality. Everyone's got a story. You don't need to convince anyone to go out to the streets. Old, young, everyone knows what it means to feel that on your skin. And so there's a long list of Ethiopian folks who have been killed in very shady circumstances by police officers in recent years. And of course, that doesn't bother Netanyahu one bit. Netanyahu couldn't care less about black Jews, but he has special animus for black non-Jews. So Netanyahu returns to the premier role as prime minister exactly a decade ago. He's reelected, and his first move is to appoint this man as Israel's interior minister, Eli Yishai. And the job of the interior minister is to determine, among other things, who is allowed into the country and who isn't allowed into the country. So he's got his hand on the levers, and he says about a new African community, a third African community in the country, about African refugees, he says, most are Muslims who think the country does not belong to us white men. He says, they bring with them a profusion of diseases, tuberculosis, AIDS, and drugs. Many have been raped by foreigners. Many Israelis have been raped by foreigners, but they are afraid to report and be stigmatized as AIDS carriers. This is from a top government minister. This is the level of racial incitement in Israel. Oh, I suppose this also didn't get reported in the mainstream media here? Surprise, surprise. But in the Israeli media, we find this kind of incitement it's not, this is commonplace. This is stuff we can see on the regular. Here, I'll give you an example of an article in an Israeli newspaper. Here, an Israeli newspaper published here in Tel Aviv said in an article, In the living quarters of the Africans, you'll find the filth, residents getting drunk, and prostitution. The Africans bring this way of life with them when they migrate. Crime in the country is on the upswing. Young women and even young men are again not safe going out on the streets alone after dark. Now,
what newspaper?
I'm about to tell you. Okay. Now, you probably will be surprised to know that this article was actually not published in the last few years. It was actually published in 1949. It was published in Haaretz newspaper, of all newspapers.
What year was that again?
1949. Okay, they weren't actually talking about these African refugees who've only immigrated in the last decade. They were actually talking about these African immigrants who were those North African Jews that I described earlier from Tunisia, Morocco, Egypt, Libya, Algeria. So the irony is that minister, Eli Yishai, who is inciting racism against those Africans, he himself is a North African. So this man, who himself is an African, a person of color, a Jew of color, he has the gall to say, these refugees don't acknowledge that the land belongs to the white man, identifying himself as the white man. This is the ingrained, internalized anti-blackness that is commonplace in Israel at the highest levels. I mean, but sadly, it's not only, the brown Jews who sadly in many cases have adopted this rhetoric, but also some of the black Jews. And we talked about this. So here, yes, Israel prides itself. What are you talking about? We're not racist. We even made a black woman the beauty queen, right? How can you call us racist? Yeah, except that, as I said, they try to divide and conquer, and they say to black Jews, well, you may be black, but you're still Jewish. Hold fast to that and use that to advance in society. And one way you can do that is by pushing down the non-Jewish black folks. And so, she says about those African refugees, a lot of the refugees are not refugees. In Tel Aviv, you can't walk around because there's rape and violence, mirroring the worst of the discourse from the government officials. So there was a question here before, or something along these lines of, okay, there's obviously some kind of difference between how black Jews and black non-Jews are treated in Israel. What's the difference? What's the disparity between them? So here's just one little example that may give you a sense of the difference there. So this is in the city of Kiryat Malachi in southern Israel. And if you can imagine this, in January 2012, this entire neighborhood, okay, banded together, and they secretly conspired. They wrote a contract out that they all signed that said, we agree never to sell apartments to Ethiopian Jews. In fact, we agree that we will never rent any apartments to black Jews. They smell bad, and we don't like them. They're criminals, and if they move into the neighborhood, all the values of our homes will drop. So they signed a secret compact between them that they all agreed never to sell their properties or rent their properties. 2012. 2012, just a few years ago. So now, this does occur even to this treatment is what's accorded to black Jews. So what's the difference between how black Jews and black non-Jews are treated? The difference is that in this case, they had a secret compact. They said, we refuse to sell to black Jews, but we had to do it secretly. We're not going to announce this. We're not going to tell everyone about it because there's still some level of shame around it. It's something they have to keep on the down low. Now, compare that to the case of black non-Jews in Israel. In terms of African refugees, they just say it openly. No one's ashamed or embarrassed about it. They publish it. So here, Tel Aviv rabbis banding together to author a religious edict saying that it is a sin against God, it is a sin against Judaism to sell or rent apartments to African refugees. Okay, this is 2010. All right, that's the difference. If I had to give one example to make that disparity clear, the difference between the racism towards black Jews and the racism towards black non-Jews in Israel. In one case, it's just as evil, but behind the mask of tolerance, when in fact towards black non-Jews it's just full on, no shame around it. So there's an effort to drive out African refugees. Now, of course, when African refugees arrive, they're called infiltrators, and this is the same exact term that was given to Palestinian refugees, because in 1947, when the United Nations announces that they're calling for the partition of Palestine into a Jewish state and a Palestinian state, and then war breaks out immediately between the two sides, we see that the objective is to drive Palestinian people out. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were displaced. Some of them, fled the fighting. Some of them were pushed out. And what's worse is that at the end of the war, once the fighting was over, that none of them were allowed back into the country to go back to their homes and villages and vineyards and fields. So they were called infiltrators. And since that time, there was never been any non-Jewish immigration to the country. Someone asked before about immigration. The government of Israel has only ever allowed Jewish immigration. It's never allowed non-Jewish immigration. A couple teeny exceptions, one person here or there, basketball players mainly. But otherwise, no non-Jews are allowed to immigrate to the country. So, but what are you going to do? Not every Jewish person wants to do grunt labor, right? So who are they going to find to fill the occupations where you sweat, right? Where you break a sweat. So, no, I mean, up until 1967, for the first 20 years of Israel's existence, first of all the Palestinian citizens of Israel are under military occupation. Okay, so today what we think of as the Palestinians in the West Bank and how they're under occupation, so that was the exact same legal status that Arab citizens of Israel had for the first 20 years. All right? And they generally would fill those roles in terms of physical labor. Okay, then in 1967, of course, Israel then conquers the West Bank, conquers Gaza, conquers other areas, and millions of more Palestinians come under its control. So then those Palestinians who don't have Israeli citizenship and can be even more exploited as laborers, since they don't have the same protections under Israeli labor law, so they become essentially the grunt labor force of the Israeli state, starting in 67. Now, after 20 years of this, those Palestinians are sick and tired of this. They're oppressed, and they know it, and they're not going to settle for it anymore. And so the Palestinian people start standing up for themselves and demanding, their own freedom. And this is when people take the streets in some of these iconic photos of the Intifada. Now, at this point, the Israeli government does a new calculus. They say, okay, we've been using Palestinians as our grunt labor force, but now we have to take into consideration that may represent a security threat. So what are we going to do? Who's going to do those jobs? So that's when they say, let's start bringing in foreign workers from the Far East. Okay, I guess they saw them as more docile and more easily exploited. They come here and have even fewer rights, and they have no ties to the land, so we can kick them out whenever we want to, and they don't have their families to support them. So starting in that times, we see that the Israeli government starts bringing in folks from the Far East. To do agricultural labor, they bring in folks from Thailand. Okay? To do construction labor, they bring in folks from China. And to take care of our grandparents, then they bring in men and women from the Philippines. Okay? But, these are the people that have performed those tasks in our society for the last couple decades. Well, now we have all of a sudden, starting in around 2006, we have these refugees coming to the country. This is the first time that there has been a wave of immigration to Israel that is not Jewish, right? And these folks are mainly, for the most part, from Eritrea and from Sudan. Now, not expecting you to know all the geopolitical details, but very, very, very briefly, Sudan, I don't need to explain, this man has ruled the country for decades. He has been indicted on war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide in Darfur. Don't need to go any further. That's Sudan. Okay? Eritrea, also, it has been ruled by the same man for decades, ever since the state was established. I mean, at least 2/3 of the people living in the country have only ever known his rule. There's never had a democratic election in their history. So people are fleeing the country by the thousands every single month. It's called the North Korea of Africa for a reason. So they're fleeing in every direction. I mean, all the countries around it are, those refugee camps are full up. Of course, it's the developing world that is bearing the brunt of taking care of these refugees. But in around 2006, we see that some of them start to make it to Israel. And when they arrive, what they find is not all that different from what the border might have looked like a century ago, right? When Israel was still Palestine. This is a photograph of that time. But when these refugees arrive, it's not too different. It's just a little bit of a barbed wire fence. It's not something that you can't cross over by throwing a blanket over it, right? I'm sure that if you were motivated enough, you could do so. And that's what people start to do. So refugees start to arrive in Israel by foot. And they go through the Sinai Peninsula, and then they reach the Israeli border, and they cross it. But there's no one who's illegal. Illegal means you snuck into the country, and you evaded capture, and you bolted for the big city. That's not what happened in any of these cases. Every single one of these refugees, they made it to the border, they crossed the border, and then they waited at the border. They stood where they were, and they waited for the Israeli government, or the Israeli army rather, to come around in their patrols and collect them. They didn't represent a threat to the state, and they didn't want to try to. They were taken in by the army. The army did a barrage of tests on them to make sure they didn't have any communicable diseases. And they did background checks on them to make sure that they didn't have criminal records. And then after a few weeks, they were allowed into the country. They'd already made it in. They were allowed into the country. Now, unfortunately, even though Israel has a massive infrastructure, including a ministry devoted to this purpose to, as I said, to subsidize the immigration of Jewish folks, including residential apartments, throughout the country for new immigrants. So if you're a Jewish person moved to the country, as I said, you get a free apartment, at least for the first few years. So there's massive housing stock, and Jewish immigration to Israel hasn't really risen in recent years. There's all kinds of apartments forget apartments, okay? People need to learn Hebrew. They've just arrived. They don't speak a word of the language. They need to be integrated into society, to be told how it works and how to possibly, smooth their entry into society. But the government doesn't want them. And so they're just dumped on the streets of Tel Aviv. And without any resources or any way to navigate the society, there's a massive homeless population right away. Now, it's not that Jewish people don't have the ability to combat poverty, okay? The problem is that these are seen as non-people. And so the very institutions of society that exist in order to aid poor Jews or poor citizens of the country are held back from African folks. So if you can imagine this, the very soup kitchens in Israel, from Tel Aviv down to Eilat, refuse admittance to African refugees. Soup kitchens did not allow in their doors African people. So, as I said, thankfully, it's not across the board. There were some Israeli activists who, in response to this, started up their own. Like, I guess you guys have Food Not Bombs. So it was an Israeli Food Not Bombs, and they got together and started doing a soup kitchen in that public park where you had this massive refugee homeless population. So at least someone came to their aid, but the bottom line was they had next to nothing and massive poverty. Now, of course, lots of 10 people in a room or 10 people in an apartment, people diving in dumpsters. Eventually, working together, finding a way, not having much of a choice in the matter, people taking low-end jobs, whatever they can do to survive. So, eking out a living. And once it's clear that there is an actual wave of immigration, it's not just a few or even a few hundred, the Netanyahu government says, okay, we got to close off the border. We got to build a wall. You've heard of this? We got to build a wall, right? So that's what the government does. As you saw, up until that point, the fence was, very easy to get across. The government said that we will now build, and they spent, $1 billion shekels to build this wall on the border with the African continent, cutting off the African continent to Israel. So they build the wall, or it's not exactly a wall, it's a high-tech fence, but it's enough that no one can get past. Since they built this, finished it in 2013, refugee immigration went to zero. All right, maybe a handful. Like every year, there's probably a dozen or something like that, or less. But for all intents and purposes, zero. So now that the wall has been built and there's no more African integration, okay, some people would say, all right, every sovereign state has a right to defend its borders and decide who it allows into the country. So let's say that we're going to grant them that right, if you agree with the state system. So, but the question is, what do you do with the 66,000 African refugees who are already in the country? Don't they have a right to live there? Well, not according to the Netanyahu government. Netanyahu is now boasting about its wall. And he's now advertising this to his European allies on the far right. He's saying, tweeting this out, "A strong Israel prevents the passage of masses of refugees to Europe." He's hoping that they too will adopt his hard right policies. "I built a wall along Israel's southern border. It stopped all illegal immigration. President Trump is right. Great success. Great idea." He now wants other countries. It's not enough for Israel to be as racist as it can get. He wants that racist policy to be adopted by every other country in the world. What does this look like for people on the streets with state-sponsored racism and incitement against African folks? Here's just a little example to give you a taste. Maybe this will give you a sense of it. So this is actually a flyer that was circulated in Tel Aviv. So they're advertising, again, we need someone to wash our apartments, right, to mop the floors. So if you need someone like this, the advertisement says, "Don't want to give work to an Arab woman for security reasons?" Right, we talked about that. Okay, so what are your options? Well, we've got a menu. You've got options here. One option, Israeli ID holder of Eastern European origin, $19 an hour. A foreign worker of Eastern European origin, in other words, a non-Jewish person, a non-Jewish white person, for only $14 an hour. You get a discount if you're willing to accept a non-Jew in your presence. And of course, a foreign worker of African origin, you only have to pay such a person $13 an hour. So in the most sickening way possible, we have it in black and white. This is how the status that people are accorded in our society. I just want to tell you that what I'm about to show is actually, it's pretty disturbing. So if people are queasy about ultraviolence, you may want to look down for a minute or look away for a second, and then I'll tell you when it's okay to look back. But there's just one slide that's extremely disturbing. So just keep that in mind. I want to give you fair warning. So on top of the indignity of being a refugee, of immigrating to Israel, and everything that implies, sadly, many of these African refugees were victimized on their way there before they even entered the country. In their efforts to acquire asylum, they paid human traffickers, or they were forced to pay human traffickers in order to get them there. Some of them were outright kidnapped by human traffickers and didn't even intend to get to Israel. But the point is, a large amount of those African refugees in Israel were severely tortured before they ever got there by Bedouin crime families in the Sinai desert. Human traffickers who, on top of the usual tortures you can imagine, the beatings and the rapes and the gang rapes and the electrocutions, they're also invented a new kind of torture where they take plastic bags and burn them and then drip them on people's bodies. So I'm sorry to have to show you that, but I thought it was important that you understand the level of suffering that these people got to even before they ever entered. The minute they got to Israel, we should have washed their feet and made a bedding for them and give them every privilege possible. But that's not what they faced. They were dumped on the streets of Tel Aviv. Now, once Netanyahu builds that wall, in 2013, as bad as it was, things start to get worse. For a time, they got extremely bad. So bad that hundreds of African refugees just went missing. To this day, the Israeli government says, we don't know what happened to about 500 of these Eritrean refugees. They're just, and I don't need to explain to you that the Israeli government is quite capable of keeping track. It's known for its security prowess, right? So it's not that they somehow slipped through the cracks. All of a sudden, 500 or so refugees hundreds went missing. Where did they go? Till this day, no Israeli journalist besides myself even took the time to look into it and find out what happened. I'm sad to say I did find out what happened, and it's a sad story that I wish I didn't have to tell you. What happened was, when people started going missing, you see signs going up. Posters, people putting up posters in Tel Aviv and on Facebook saying, our family members are missing, our friends are vanished. Where are they? Has anyone seen anyone? Please report it to so-and-so. So no one knew where they went. One of these people I was able to track down. And his name was Ablel. Now Ablel, like many of the Eritrean refugees who came to Israel, went through a very difficult journey to get there. And of course, once he got there, it was challenging to say the least, but like many refugees, he worked as hard as he could. He labored away, and eventually he was able to, improve his life, and he was actually able to rent out a place and start a restaurant, an Eritrean restaurant in downtown Tel Aviv, to his credit. So, working away, he managed to, improve his own life. And I only wish that this could have been the story of all Eritrean immigrants to the country, that they could have just integrated into society and become respectable, contributing members of Israeli society. Sadly, one day, he has to go to the bank, to deposit the money that he got from the restaurant, and he's literally steps away from the American embassy in Tel Aviv, or I guess what was formerly the American Embassy of Tel Aviv. Now that the American Embassy has been moved to Jerusalem, it is no longer, this building doesn't have embassy status anymore. But what for decades was the American Embassy in Tel Aviv, he literally steps away from there, and he has to take a cab back to get to his restaurant. He steps into a taxi, and boom, he's beaten and drugged and driven down to the desert and thrown into a ditch. And then in the dead of night, he's taken to the border, that brand new border fence Netanyahu is so proud of. Well, it certainly stops most refugees from, climbing over and entering Israel, but it doesn't stop smugglers who are quite capable of figuring out the ins and outs and realizing how to get around it. And so we started to see the beginnings of slave trading in Israel itself, where folks like Ablel were whisked off the streets of Tel Aviv in midday, taken to the border, and sold from one group to another. And then those Egyptian criminals took him, threw him in one of those metal containers, those shipping containers, and held him there with other Eritrean refugees, tied them together, and tortured them again. After all the tortures that they experienced on their way to Israel, then they don't even have security on the streets of Tel Aviv. You see folks being kidnapped off the streets of Tel Aviv, dragged down to the desert, crossing back into Egypt, and being tortured there. Again, I'm going to show one of these disgusting photos. But this is the reality. It's important that you understand how deep it gets. Now, after several months more of torture, that no one knows about and no one cares about. This is how little Black Lives Matter in Tel Aviv. That you can be kidnapped off the street in broad daylight. So eventually, after several months, he has to go to they take him out to make a phone call, because how do they make their money from these tortures? They torture you, and they call your relatives on the phone in order to, say, please help me, send money to this account. And in that way, they hope to extort money from these pitiful refugees. And so on one of these occasions when they brought him out to make a phone call to call his relatives, he managed to run away, slip away. The person chasing after him tripped and fell, and he actually managed to make it to the road, with much effort. So a very, very long, arduous journey that would be too complicated to explain right now, but he managed to make it, after great struggle, to northern Africa, to the Libyan coast, barely evades ISIS. At this time, ISIS is in full effect, and in fact, they started executing Eritrean refugees at this time. Some of these Eritrean refugees who had been living in Israel and who were forced out of Israel because they weren't Jews, then by the time they got to the northern Libyan coast to try to get to Europe, they're now kidnapped by ISIS and murdered for not being Muslims. So Ablel may have been the first person to go through this disgusting journey, but he certainly was not the last. I'm happy to say there's a bright side to the story. Ablel himself finally made it past ISIS, managed to make it across the Mediterranean, made it into Switzerland, and thankfully he was able to get refugee status there because of course he damn well deserves it, and he married another Eritrean refugee and they have a child now, and I'm happy to report he's starting a new life, thankfully. But unfortunately, back behind in Israel, the fate of the rest of the Eritrean refugees and the other African refugees, we can't say the same for them. In Israel, the government just doesn't even look at your refugee application. If you're applying for asylum, it just ignores almost all of the applications. And then if it even looks at your application, it just outright rejects 99 point whatever percent of them. So it's an infinitesimal, maybe a handful of refugees that have been granted status, but 99.9% rejected outright. So again, Eli Yishai, the interior minister, he explains the Israeli policy. He says, how are we going to drive them out? Until I am able to deport them, I'll jail them and make their lives miserable, he says. Once again, did this get any play in the mainstream media here? No. Why not? So this is Israeli government policy, and then they implement it. They publish the Sofer report, which is the government policy on refugees. And in that report, it says that there will be a concentration of all the infiltrators that are living in the country. You're not following the story. No one seems to care. They're not embarrassed. They even use this exact wording to describe the policy towards Africans. And so that's what the government does. It starts concentrating them. It starts rounding them up. In 2013, it starts rounding up refugees off the streets of Tel Aviv, and they take them down to a desert detention center that they built specifically for this purpose, the largest of its kind in the world. And in it, it's in the middle of nowhere. There's nothing to do, nowhere to go. It's like surrounded by nothing except for sand and firing ranges. And so in this desert detention center, so-called, they concentrate thousands of African refugees. Now, at this point, I wouldn't say Israel is a democracy, but at least it has some semblance of democratic institutions. And Israel's Supreme Court does strike down this policy. It says these people have committed no crime. By what right do you incarcerate them? They've done nothing to deserve it. So you can't just jail them indefinitely. So the courts say you can't keep these people forever. And after a time, some of the government starts to release these people back into society. But then it goes down to the local level. They say, well, we don't want black folks in our cities. So you start having Israeli cities saying, okay, well, you may be allowed to leave that detention center, but you can't live in Tel Aviv, you can't work in Jerusalem, you can't go to Petah Tikva, you can't travel to Netanya, and there's like 6 or 7 or 8 Israeli cities that African refugees are forbidden from living. In fact, you even have mayors of Israeli towns like putting police presence at the entrance of cities. When you have the refugees finally starting to stream out of this detention center, you actually have police forces preventing the entry. From the American context, you've heard of sundown towns, where black folks were prevented from living and working, from sleeping at night, from making their homes. I don't mean to demean in any way or to diminish at all the anti-blackness and the state-sponsored anti-blackness, you know, the internalized, the institutional racism in this country. But in my humble opinion, this is on another level. And what does that look like on the streets of Tel Aviv, where the majority of the African refugee population lives? It looks like graffiti. Expel the N-word. It looks like firebombing the homes of African refugees and even firebombing an African nursery in Tel Aviv. And I suppose they didn't report that in Philadelphia papers either. This is our reality. Now, of course, again, there are Jewish folks in Israel and elsewhere that are disgusted by this treatment of African refugees, and people who, as soon as that nursery was firebombed, they went out into the streets and protested against them and spoke out against this racism. But the problem is that they are a minority, a small minority, and that they're overwhelmed by a massive majority of folks who want the Africans gone. The quicker the better. So, May 23rd, 2012, the Tel Aviv anti-African pogrom. 1,000 Israeli Jews run rampant through the streets of Tel Aviv, attacking every African person they come across, smashing African shops, cafes. And why did they do such a thing? What triggered them? It was because Israeli members of Knesset and ministers stood on the podium in South Tel Aviv and incited against African refugees, with Miri Regev, the top female official in the ruling Likud party. She says, the Sudanese are a cancer in our body. And in that word, she sent off these pogromists to do their dirty work. Now, I should admit that Miri Regev did apologize for what she'd said. She said, I apologize. The problem is, she then explained, I apologize, I did not intend to hurt cancer patients.
What?
Sad that she compared Israeli cancer victims to Africans, not the Africans to cancer. This is how disgusting it gets. And what's the response of the organization that says that it's a Jewish civil rights organization? The ADL, the Anti-Defamation League. How do they respond to this pogrom? I mean, aren't they supposed to be an anti-racist organization? You'd think so, huh? Well, this is what Abe Foxman had to say about it. Among other things, that he sympathizes with Israeli citizens whose personal security has been compromised by the lawlessness engendered by these African refugees. And he praised Netanyahu, commended him for his commitment to resolving this crisis responsibly. That's the ADL's statement on this pogrom. Of course, this is hysterical. What a joke. Thank you for doing our dirty work. Thanks you for doing our hasbara. So, of course, Netanyahu and Regev have a good time of it. If you can imagine, this was Netanyahu's leadership on this. How did he respond to the pogrom? He appointed that woman to be Miri Regev then became the chair. He appointed her to be the chair of the Interior Committee, the very committee that determines the fate of African refugees. So he put the pogromist in charge of the victims. Now, of course, since she's been moving up the ranks and into government, they need someone else to fill her space, another young ultra-racist. So Netanyahu has now tapped this woman to fill her slot. This is Mai Golan. Who's Mai Golan? Well, he's already ensuring that she's been well funded by Kenneth Abramowitz, the head of Likud USA, okay, Netanyahu's political party's largest fundraiser in the United States. He's now not only funding Netanyahu, he's funding Mai Golan. Who's Mai Golan? Well, she's already been politically active for several years. How did she cut her teeth in the Israeli political system? She's been groomed for power by, who is this man that's speaking on her behalf? Who is Mai Golan, and who is the man, Michael Ben-Ari, who's sponsoring her rise to power? This man, Michael Ben-Ari, is the head of the Kahanist movement in Israel. That's her political patron. Meir Kahane, one and the same. Now, For those who aren't familiar with the backstory, this is basically the founding father of Israeli fascism. Okay? Too many details to go into, but basically this is the furthest right-wing party in Israel. And now Netanyahu is bringing them into the government, if you can imagine that. So it's not only, this is at the memorial service, the annual memorial that celebrates Meir Kahane, the man who made it popular to call for ethnic cleansing, who made it no longer a badge of shame to call for eliminating non-Jews from the country. So not only does he praise Kahane at his annual memorial service, but Mai Golan does so as well. This is who Netanyahu has made. This Kahanist is now the youth representative of the Likud party. She has gotten the slot on the Likud list, and once elections occur in just 2 weeks' time, she's going to be elected to the Knesset. This is now another member of parliament. Someone who I have personally filmed in downtown Tel Aviv leading anti-African rallies, screaming, "I am proud to be a racist." Screaming, "May you be raped in your grave." Yes. Poetic. Well, what do you expect? With this level of incitement, it has a result. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. And so what happens in the years that follow? We see an Eritrean refugee family on the streets of downtown Tel Aviv, father, mother, 2 young daughters, and this 1-year-old baby girl. An Israeli Jewish man walks up to the family and stabs the baby in the head. 3 times. Thankfully, she survived, not without damage, of course. She did manage to pull through. Now, and again, I don't mean to suggest that this is like commonplace, that people are slaughtering African people in the streets willy-nilly. Obviously, anyone who stabs a little baby, a 1-year-old baby, is psychotic under any measure, right? We can't say that all Israeli, nothing even remotely close to that. But the issue is, why did this psycho stab a black baby? Why did he choose an African refugee family to attack? And he explained his reasoning, even though the police at first said, "Oh, no, there's nothing to do with racism." Yeah, okay. Once they interrogated him, he explained it in detail. He said, quote, "I tried to kill her because I hate them. They're black. A black baby, blacks in general, are terrorists." Well, she wasn't the last victim. The following year, this man, another refugee from Eritrea, Haftam Zarhum, he was lynched in the Beersheba Central Bus Station. This man, Babakir, he was a refugee from Sudan, and he was lynched in downtown Petah Tikva. Petah Tikva is a suburb of Tel Aviv. He was lynched right in front of Petah Tikva City Hall, beaten to death, just like Emmett Till, because he spoke to some white girls, some Israeli teenagers. He just walked by and blah, 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 exchanged a few words with them. The reason we know this is because it's all on CCTV. It was right outside the city hall. So there's evidence. So you see, he walks over to them, talks to them, and then walks away after 10 seconds, posing no threat whatsoever. Seconds later, a group of Israeli youth jump on him and pummel him and beat him for an hour and a half right outside City Hall for daring to speak to Jewish girls. So how did they even know it was him? Just like Emmett Till, they crushed his face. He was unrecognizable, even to his own brother afterwards. The only way they were able to recognize him is because since he was a refugee from Darfur and he'd escaped the ethnic cleansing there, he had lost some of his fingers in the fighting. And so because he lacked some fingers on his hand, his brother only that way was able to recognize him. That's how badly he was pummeled. So with this level of ultraviolence, it's no wonder that half the African refugee population has fled in recent years. They realize there's no hope, there's no chance, there's no future. So many people have decided to flee in every other possible direction. And of course, they get sent back to Africa. It doesn't matter to the Israeli government where they go, but once they get there, they're still trying to find refuge. So they make their way to the north, to the Mediterranean coast, and then of course try to cross the Mediterranean. And how many people, we've heard the stories of thousands who've drowned in the Mediterranean trying to seek freedom. Some folks made it, managed to arrive on dry land, but many didn't. And a couple years ago, when a ship full of nearly 1,000 refugees drowned in the Mediterranean, I mean, almost 1,000 people on one ship met their deaths. And how did the Israeli government respond? Well, what Israel Katz had to say about it, this is Netanyahu's number 2. This is the number 2 in Israel's ruling Likud party. Minister Israel Katz says, in response to that boat going down, see how correct the government policy was? You can give us a compliment. We deserve your praise. This is proof positive that we did the right thing. 1,000 Africans drowning at sea. I want some credit for that. Now, last thing I'll say, again, I can't emphasize enough, this is not every Israeli, this is not every Jew. Yes, there are people who are doing what they can and beyond. People who are standing in solidarity. People who feel it's their moral obligation to stand in solidarity with these folks. So just as one example of this, last year in 2018, you had this movement of Holocaust survivors. Okay, Jewish survivors of the Nazi Holocaust who've spent the last decades of their life in Israel, banding together and saying, you know, I will take these African refugees into my home. You know, I will give them refuge. I will make a place for them. Stop oppressing them. Stop discriminating against them. Stop pushing them out. So, you know, I have nothing but love for those people who stood and were counted in these dark days. Much respect for them. But if you can imagine this, this is how those few folks who stand in the face of this hatred, this is how they're treated. When that was reported in the Israeli media, that these Holocaust survivors were opening their homes up to African refugees, this is the kind of responses that got onto the talkbacks on the Israeli newspapers reporting on this. This is almost as bad as those torturous images I showed you earlier. These are the kinds of comments we saw. In the Holocaust, I bet their parents helped the Germans. Get the hell out along with them. We don't lack for Jew haters in this country. Too bad with them, Hitler didn't finish the job. I wish upon you an ocean of venereal diseases. May you experience rape and violent attacks. May an infiltrator split your body in half. I'd like to commit a Holocaust on all the leftists. Drink your blood and fuck your women. I would do anything to not have to tell you these things, but I've been left with no choice. So, the very last thing I will say to you is to remind you again and again and again, this isn't everyone. This isn't across the board. There are those who are disgusted as much as you and I are by this anti-blackness, by this lethal anti-blackness. And that's why it's all the more important to remember that there are 4 camps. And it's also important to remember that yes, there are those Jewish folks, American Jews, who were integral to the civil rights movement, who were part of the Freedom Riders, who went down and put their bodies on the line. Of the white folks, all the Freedom Riders, about half of them were black and half of them were white. And it's important to note that about half of those white folks were Jews. And that's to their credit, and that's to our credit. But whose credit? It's the credit of those people. Because there were only a few hundred Freedom Riders altogether. So even though, yes, Jewish people did amount to half of those Freedom Riders, that was only a very teeny tiny percentage of the population, of the white population and of the Jewish population. And the ADL and the other groups that claim to speak for the Jewish community have no right to claim the mantle of those Jewish heroes, of those martyrs who paid the price with their lives. Because the people who stood in solidarity with black folks then are the same Jews who stand in solidarity with Palestinian people today. It's not the ADL. It's the humanist Jews. And so yes, 2 Jews, 3 opinions, 4 political camps. I heard something earlier today about anti-Semitism. What's anti-Semitism? Can I criticize Israel? Good goddamn! I think if I've told you nothing else today, there's a lot of reason to criticize. And if you're wondering whether your criticism steps over the boundaries of what's considered anti-Semitic, I would recommend not listening to the ADL or the JDL or any other group that claims to speak for our community. Maybe listen to those humanist Jews who are actually proven anti-racists. And maybe they have the moral right to say what's anti-Semitic and what's not, and what's anti-black and what's not. Thank you for taking the time to listen to these stories. Thank you so much. Thank you, sisters. The only thing I'll say, before you leave, last thing, you're welcome. I encourage you to share my reports. I've written hundreds of articles, hundreds of videos. They're all on my website, davidsheen.com. It's just my name, davidsheen.com. Please share stuff, social media. Of course, you're welcome to throw some money at me in Patreon because this stuff doesn't pay for itself. It's not very lucrative to report on racism, to say the least. So I'm very appreciative if it's in person or it's online. And thanks so much for coming out.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.